it looks like Michael's ready to start the recording. That means the streaming's probably going well. So we are going to begin recording now, and then let's start it out. Feel free, by the way, to ask questions like kind of at any time, because we're just going to make this really conversational. We have some stuff we want to talk about. We've even got a little guided tour for ourselves, but feel free to stop by putting questions into the chat or anything like that. All right, here we go. So, hi, and welcome to A Pint of Ulysses, where we're just going to sit around and talk about Ulysses for a little while, for 18 weeks, in fact. But you can, if you don't want to sit here every night for 18 weeks, which is perfectly understandable, you could feel free to look at it on your own when we condense these recordings and put them onto YouTube and back up on our Facebook site. So tonight, the Ulysses class that we're doing at Pint of Ulysses is going through the first episode, what other people might call chapter of the book, sometimes called Telemachus by people who have done it more than once. But we're also going to spend a little bit of tonight doing some background on the book and its very strange origins. So Mahak, would you go ahead and take over for a moment and introduce these lovely people who I'm sitting next to, who I already know?
Yeah, it would be my honor. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our first chapter. I would love to introduce Chad and Megan, so I'll begin. Chad Rutkowski is a lawyer with the law firm of Baker Hostetler, who focuses on the intersection of copyright and technology. Chad co-leads Baker's digital transformation and data economy team and is the secretary of the Copyright Society. Chad was the business manager of Throwaway Horse, an iPad app company that created comic book adaptations of literary works and that received some press in 2010 over a dispute with Apple in censoring its adaptation of Ulysses, called UYLSSES. Chad studied Ulysses with Dr. Timothy Martin of Rutgers University, Camden, and has been a lifelong fan of the book and attendee at Bloomsday Festivals in Philadelphia. So welcome, Chad, and thank you for joining us.
Nice to see everybody. Welcome.
And then we also have in the pub tonight, Megan. Megan Quigley is an associate professor of English, Irish Studies, and Gender and Women's Studies at Villanova University. She is the author of Modernist Fiction and Vagueness, Philosophy, Form, and Language, and is currently co-editing a volume on revisionary approaches to T.S. Eliot, entitled Eliot Now. Other recent publications can be found in Poetics Today, Hermeneutica Literaria, and Time Present. She has held fellowships from the Harry Ransom Center at UT Austin, the Huntington Library, the Beinecke Library at Yale, and St. Edmund Hall at Oxford. So welcome, Megan, and we're looking very forward to today's class.
Thank you. Hi.
All right. So we are going to talk about the very strange origins of this very strange book. And to do that, we're going to talk a little bit about Joyce's background, and also a little bit about the city that it comes from, Dublin. Michael, I think you have access to that, either that PDF or that keynote.
I do. I'm going to be honest. We just had to switch the streaming software. So if you want to spend like 5 minutes with me figuring that out, that's totally fine, and I can do that. But I also think if you want to move on very quickly, we could do that. But we want up the slideshow.
Okay. Let me see. I'm trying to see how we should screen share that. Then maybe I can screen share it from here.
Actually,
okay. So that's up.
What I can do it. I'm so sorry. Let me think. Let me see this. Let me just see if this is no. I'm sorry. You should do it. You should do it.
Wait, you just had it.
I had a few, but not for the stream.
Okay.
Sure.
Let's see here if I can. Yeah, share content. Am I not a host anymore somehow?
I can make him one very quickly, brother.
Make it, okay. I was the host. Okay, so what screen let me do it? No, it's only let me do that.
Can I say something while you're doing it?
You can.
Okay.
Do something while you're
Okay. So I looked up today how much a first edition of Ulysses would cost. So we can guess. How much do you think it would cost to get a nice, not brand new 1922 Shakespeare and Co.? Oh, I want Shakespeare and Co. I want the blue cover. No, I want the brand new ones.
Real McCoy. 500 grand.
500 grand. You're too much.
Too much.
$580,000.
Yeah, I know. I thought we could buy one and bring it here. Would you mind getting us one? It would be so good to have it in the
I
pub
love it.
right here
Yeah.
with us. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Under lock and key.
Mhm. Well, the first one I saw was 95,000 pounds. So
Pounds.
95,000.
We need to get Elon Musk. We need to get Elon Musk on this and like
Yeah.
drive that up like Dogecoin.
Yeah.
It'd be,
Not-
it'd be less than Eric Clapton's Stratocaster, right?
Yeah. Dogecoin is infinitely more ridiculous than a first edition of a Sylvia Beach Shakespeare and Company.
Used to be,
Ulysses.
and
Come
not
on.
sure anymore.
Come on.
but yes.
Yeah.
There was one for 25, but I think it was marked up.
Can we have Beeple make it into an
Heavily
NFT,
used.
please, and really generate some value here?
Well, I'm having trouble getting my keynote to come up, but I'm going to go ahead and we're going to bring it up for us to see, which means we can't see your faces in the meantime. So we're going to talk first about what Megan just mentioned, which is this book was first published in 1922 by Shakespeare and Company. It had seen other iterations before that. It had been serialized. It had been stolen when it came over to the U.S. But the real first publication will be on Joyce's birthday, February 2nd, 1922, in the full book form. Now, we should talk a little bit about the origins for. I'm sorry, did Michael say something? I don't have my screen up. Okay. We should talk a little bit about Dublin and Joyce when he was younger and the things that formed this book. The book is, of course, written after he's left Dublin in some kind of a self-imposed exile. But the Dublin he grew up in, it was actually a relatively small city. And I think it's really important we remember that they were kind of living under a foreign power, the Irish at this time. That there was a crippling poverty in Ireland, and that there was not a lot of chance for any kind of sustained income for a lot of the men that you'll see marching through the pages of these books. They seem to be just all hanging out in bars, and it's important to remember that they're doing that because they don't have jobs, the vast majority of them. The population size of Dublin is relatively small. The area of Dublin itself is also really rather small, no more than you couldn't walk to in a regular average day from one side to the other.
Do you know what kind of American city it would like be a parallel for? I was wondering what Americans, having finally appeared in a city for the first time in a long time, I was wondering what kind of city it might be equivalent to.
That's an excellent question. I mean, I've walked through Dublin now a number of times, and it's tightly packed, like Philadelphia itself is. And there's a lot of that similar architecture. It grew up during a lot of that same period, that we had some of our best architecture. It does feel a lot like Philadelphia's center city-wise, but Jack is over there nodding his head. I think he feels the same way. Like South Philadelphia, for those that know Philly. But of course, the difference is that Philadelphia, unlike Dublin, just kept sprawling and expanding. The expression of beyond the pale sort of exists for a long time in Dublin history. And that's that idea that, there's this, and then after there, it's all those Irish people. It's all that country stuff that goes on. So yeah, I think that's a good key point. And I think it's important to realize that small cities are like small towns in which people know one another's stories pretty easily. And there's a lot of There's a great Joycean word, gossipacious. There's a gossipaciousness to the way that he gets these stories. I mean, Joyce famously said that he didn't really feel like he had his own original stories. You know, he had the stories of others that he could hang things on and make something with. And that's why this is such a book of the city. We also need to note the tremendous religious divide, you know, that's going on within Dublin at that time. And it colors a lot of the way the main characters are seen, you know, based upon that religious divide. And then we're going to see numerous chapters that are going to handle the growing spirit of Irish republicanism. So.
I was looking today at the Christmas dinner scene in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, just to sort of remember, you know, Parnell, my dead king, and the drama of that scene, both to feel the growing spirit of the divide and also the religious divide and the political divide. So,
how important do you think it is, Megan, to have read Portrait prior to coming in? We're going to handle a little bit more of this later, but what do you think? Is it really important for first-time readers of Ulysses to have read Portrait? You can answer too, because I see you over there.
I really do. Dubliners, I don't really care. I'm not a Dubliners person. I'm bored and I don't know. It depresses me. But Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, I do think it's really important. Yeah, I like it for setting up Stephen's character, even if you think he's a different character in the next book. And I also like it for thinking about Kevin Detmar, who's a friend of ours, wrote in a book of his that Finnegan's Wake explodes the idea of the word, but Ulysses explodes the idea of the book. And I feel like you need to read the Portrait book and then you get the explosion in Ulysses. I don't know.
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent way to look at that. How about you?
Apart from that excellent point, you know, I beg to differ. You know, it's so self-contained, right? Ulysses is such its own little world. Stephen Daedalus, I think, just, you know, comes to full fruition, you know, in the book itself. That I don't know that Portrait really adds something to it, right? And who he emerged from at the end of Portrait, you know, really isn't who he is in this book. So I don't necessarily feel that there's a factual context missing, or that there's anything about the plot that you can't follow to the extent it has a plot, you know, or anything about his character that's not discoverable, you know, from within the, you know, Ulysses itself.
So we just got slipped a, oh, you brought up the population numbers for me. Oh,
Fact checker. This is
Paul,
awesome.
Paul Santamore over here, fact checker extraordinaire. Paul's, who you're not seeing on camera yet, but we should try to figure that out, is my teaching partner over at University of Pennsylvania. And we've been down this road numerous times, but he had the numbers right in his head. No, you Googled, did you? God bless you. So on that, the population of Dublin is, yeah, it was 400,000. That's similar to Cleveland, Ohio. So, although much more famous. So, all right. So, in talking about, now, if you have read Portrait, we're obviously dealing with a lot of that earlier bit of Stephen, who is clearly in that book an autobiographical version of the author, and has very similar things occurring within his life and his family structure. Not exactly the same, but and it's worth mentioning though that he's the oldest of 10 surviving children, oldest boy. There were also 4 other children that didn't survive.
13 pregnancies, right?
I thought it was 14.
14?
I think it's 14. There's 4 other. Yeah. Well,
Google that.
Google.
It's a fact checker.
Yeah. I know yeah. So, so this was part of the Irish Catholic family world of that time. And there's also this tremendous connection to his mother, which we get out of Portrait, certainly, that we only get hinted at within Ulysses. And the sort of troubling relationship that he had with his father. Do you want to do anything about that, Megan?
I was still thinking about the mother.
Go.
I was thinking about, so I always do try to teach portrait in the class, but pragmatically it is hard given the length of a semester to anyway. But I guess I do like the relationship between Stephen and his mother, especially the way it ends at the end of the book with her packing his clothes. And I think we're going to get to that later. And I think in Ulysses, she's a more haunting presence, whereas in Portrait, you sort of see her helping him to try to become the individual or the hero he might become. And there's that line he writes in a letter, I think he says, he curses the system that made his mother a victim of his father's cruelty and of his own, deprivation. I can't remember exactly the word he uses. And then in Mina Purifor, he again curses the system that makes them have to give the breast year after year. So I think thinking about his mother as well as someone who is constantly giving birth and constantly breastfeeding and her life is in danger with that, I think is an important. She's both a spiritual guide, but also a victim of the system. And when you think of Ulysses as cursing systems, I think that's an important one to think through. The mother son God.
Excellent. Yeah. He was, I think he was the youngest boy admitted to Clongo's Woods. Yeah. And just precocious, but got him into some trouble now and again. This is really very funny that people are slipping me things on napkins when I said I wanted to keep it conversational. Quinn has just sent me another napkin. Not as much, not as much as they used to. And be careful, my wife's here tonight too. Could I make Michael and Mehek co-hosts? No, Michael can make.
I can't. I made you the host, so that's why you do it very quickly. Just look at the note and then keep talking. You got it.
And we're gonna take this out when we edit,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It's good. Just do it. Great. Thank you.
Okay, you two are now co-hosts, which means you have some questions at this point, so that I don't have to keep talking.
Yeah, could I'm sorry to one of our speakers, but just in terms of people who have not read A Portrait of the Artist, what are the sort of takeaways that you think are important to understand? I mean, we talk about like these sort of big things, like one of the novels is exploding your conception of the word, the next of the novel itself. Someone like me, I've read maybe half of the portrait. What are the central? I mean, what is a central understanding, or sort of the important thing to understand when you come right in to Ulysses?
I think that's great. You want to go?
Sure. I think that you're not sure when you finish Portrait Artist as a young man if it's an epic and he's going to fly by those nets and become the next writer of the great Ulysses, or if by the end of the book he has been so undermined by questioning religion or sexuality or his own sort of fickle nature that in fact it's a very ironic book. It becomes a diary at the end, a journal at the end, and then he is no longer any kind of hero. So one way to think about that is he Icarus or Daedalus at the end of the book? Has he become the one who is flying away, or is he the one who is going to crash down? And how much does the Catholic Church, how much does the division in the Irish nation and nationalism, and how much does all that sort of play a part into wondering why this cute, sweet little boy who at the beginning is talking about a moo cow, how at the end he might be a little bit of an asshole and you're not sure how he became that way. And is he going to be a hero or are we done with him? Because, and so I think that's important.
I think you get in the early pages of Telemachus, right, that Stephen is, full blown, shoegaze, emo boy, shoegazer that he's just so self-contained, right? You know who he is. And Joyce does such an amazing job in picking details, both in the dialogue, the internal dialogue, right? That fickleness, that self-importance. He becomes sort of that boy that you're talking about. Does he become this epic, hero? Does he become a failure? He sort of is neither, right? He's, kind of just this self-absorbed, douchey kind of, penniless, artist kid. You know who his father is, right? He leaves all the clues sort of within the book as to the relationship and the tensions between him and his father. He leaves all the clues in the tensions between the relationship with him and his mother within Ulysses. So to me, Portrait of the Artist stands alone, and it's a marvelous book for its own reasons, and it has a lot to say about Irishness and what was going on at the time. Ulysses, I think, largely stands apart, at least in my mind. Like, in terms of who Stephen is, what he does, how he moves the action forward, how he, figures into the book, it's all there. I think it's all self-contained.
We have a question from the
Actually,
chat.
I don't know, Quinn, if we can hear your sound. So
All right, I will be the bodiless voice. We've got a question from Chris in the chat. What is Portrait exploding, if not the word or the book?
What is Portrait exploding, if not the word or the book? You gotta have this one. Look at you.
What is it exploding? Might be my answer there.
All right, I was going to do something on Joyce and gamesmanship there in just a minute, but you go.
No.
This is a good question.
So again, I think. Oh, sorry.
He started it.
You are the sunshine of my life. Ooh, sorry, gosh, I'm so excited. What is it exploding? I think Chad and I are just going to sit here fighting on the couch. We're going to be like the loser couch fighting, but I think that I think it does have to do with the Bildungsroman, the idea. So maybe it is a novel again, but that you started with this boy who you watched him growing and you invested in him emotionally, which I think is different from Ulysses because he's fully formed. So I think it's exploding that. I think it has the seeds for each of the other kinds of explosion in it too, down to the word, the logos. There's that great questioning of when he thinks about Ireland and where Ireland fits on the map, right? But then also the taking apart, the deconstruction of where does the universe start, and God, what's the speech I'm trying to think of? God, where's the end of it and the start of it? Anybody help me? You know what I'm talking about. So I think it explodes many of those important questions.
Objection, Your Honor. Non-responsive. I think, right, the question was, that if Ulysses is exploding a book, the question was, does Portrait of the Artist also explode books and words? Is Portrait of the Artist?
I think you can see it two ways.
Okay.
I think you can read it two ways, and that's where, if you think it's like an Irish nationalism, like leading you to the epic, or you think it's an ironic, it sort of falls apart. So it might do both.
So that juxtaposition between what Portrait did and moved the book or challenged sort of the novel form in one way, completely went in a different fashion and was much more intense with Ulysses. Is that sort of?
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. I love it when I don't have to talk that long. I do want to say something though that I always find interesting about Stephen and the way that we start here with Stephen. Now, there's a Homeric parallel because the story of the Odyssey begins from Telemachus's point of view. But there's a little bit of gamesmanship going on with Joyce in like, oh yeah, that other book, you all read that, right? like, oh, if you haven't, go read that other book. This is not a sequel. It's just his way of sort of almost believing that his audience should be that dedicated to him from the first page of this big book. And Paul and I were doing some interviews for the Rosenbach's upcoming movie, and he asked me what I thought, what was the reason that Joyce wrote Ulysses, and I said hubris. So, I think that's a really big element of how we look at the Stephen bits in terms of gamesmanship. All right, I'm going to go back to our little talk, unless there's more questions.
We actually have another question from Michael. So I'm not sure why he didn't just say it himself. But the question is, you guys talk about how Stephen is either Daedalus or Icarus, but Ulysses introduces him as Telemachus. How does this change our conception of the character? What has happened to him in the interim?
Well, the big thing that happened is his mom died and he had to come home. That's a really big deal. I think that Stephen feels a little bit like a washout when we encounter him here. He doesn't see any way to get out of Dublin again, or even to really survive being in Dublin now. And in many ways, and we'll be talking about this throughout, you can sort of see the Stephen bits of Ulysses as kind of like a haunting, like a ghost story, very much. I think that Stephen is haunted a little bit by not just by his mother, as we seem to see happening, but by his feelings about not bending down, and his feelings about his own arrogance in that moment, I think are a key part of how he's changed. Megan, you want to take that?
No, I mean, I think I agree with you.
You agree with me and her at the same time?
Yeah.
Mark your calendars, everybody. All right, so let's go back to where we were on talking points, I think. I think we did enough on that. So Joyce graduates in 1902, and then we get that great big moment where he gets to go off, and he goes to Paris to study, and then has to turn it right away and come right back home. But he's also started to hold some reputation because of his within the Dublin literary crowd. He's considered to be somebody when he comes back, and in this regard, he's Stephen. Joyce is Stephen in that regard. He's held within some regard, even though he's not quite in the circles yet. And I think that's important to remember. It's a great moment that I always like to talk about as an artist, where Haynes is thinking about doing a chapbook of Stephen's sayings, and the first response that Stephen has is, "Will I make any money by it?" It's a big thing. There's no patronage for the kind of artist that Stephen wants to be, and it seems to be drawn into, or it seems to be have no choice in, frankly. So, anyone want to say anything more about him in that regard? So he did, as we are going to see in the Telemachus episode, he did live in that Martello Tower off Sandy Cove. He did live with somebody much like Mulligan, Oliver St. John Gogarty. And even in this year, in 1904, he's already begun to write Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He has his first story published, which is Sisters from Dubliners, and it's published in the Irish Homestead, which people like to call the pig's paper, because it is still though it has tremendous weight with the Irish literati, it's still basically an agricultural paper. And then the other big thing that happens, of course, in 1904 is he meets Nora Barnacle. And who wants to say something about that?
Nor, no.
Okay.
She had auburn hair. Does anyone have auburn hair anymore? Don't we just have brown hair? But she had.
She's from Galway. I knew that. I saw she was in Galway. I've been to her house in Galway, where she grew up.
Nora, as we know, is going to be an incredibly important force in Joyce's life. And also in that year, just to kind of polish out in 1904, they leave Dublin together and eventually settle in Trieste. We will have a lot more on Nora as we go through this, but she's a major force to be considered.
And maybe he thought he was marrying beneath himself a little bit, or others have down the road, that she was more body and attractiveness rather than mind and intellect, and how that plays out, how you look at Stephen or how you look at Molly Bloom, that sort of that tension. Also, of course, dirty underpanty letters. But
Yeah, they always find the letters, like we said.
One thing on that. And this is not something that I know a ton about, but it was remarkable to me. I actually took classes in Dublin. I took law classes. I studied for abroad for a month and a half and was at Trinity. And just walking around the bars in Dublin at the time as a young man, the striations, the walls between what were called colchies, as I understand it, which is anybody who's not from Dublin, right? So, I mean, basically you're either from Dublin in Ireland or you're a hick. Even if you're from such a cool town as Galway, you're a hick. So for, a Dubliner, right, to have married somebody from Galway, somebody outside of Dublin, certainly sort of layers into that as well. And this is, whatever, 100 years later, people at bars were still sort of throwing out that, those striations, making those judgments, as easily as the Guinness went down.
Yeah, we should do something about that. Yeah, I think that's very true. I think there's an interesting choice there, but he also in Dubliners, Greta Conroy's also a country girl, and we can see very much Gabriel Conroy as kind of a what would have happened if Joyce wouldn't have left attitude, that seems to pervade that story. What I want to talk about briefly here is he had a lot of help, even though I said there wasn't a really good source of income. The amount of money he could expect to get paid for short stories like The Sisters is just not that much.
And how long it took Portrait to get Dubliners. It was, I don't know if are you going to talk about that?
No.
I mean, the 8-year fiasco, I think it was, and finally getting published and then pulled back again. And so how he also struggled to get his words out there so much.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of vital. There are a number of people that really supported Joyce, and they're mostly all women, which I think is really interesting and an important feature to get talked about in terms of modernism of the time. Most of that support came through an intermediary figure, which would be Ezra Pound. But it was the likes of Harriet Shaw Weaver and Edith Rockefeller McCormick, and then publishers Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, as a little review, that gave him not just some income to keep him writing, believing in his talent, but also to find a source for that work to go out. And that's an amazing thing. And then eventually, certainly needs to be mentioned, is Sylvia Beach and her partner, Adrienne Monnier. Sylvia Beach was a bookseller before she decided that she would publish this book that had already found its way to being banned in the, sort of the biggest market possible. So, so a lot of bravery from those people that really supported him all the way through. So he moves to Paris in 1920, and he's already started serializing parts of Ulysses in the Little Review, the magazine I just mentioned by Anderson and Heap, and they've been coming out pretty steadily until 1921 when the shit hits the fan. Chad's going to talk about that in a minute. But afterwards, I think it's really great that Beach comes up to him, meets him, and decides that she'd like to offer to publish it. And she'd never published a novel through Shakespeare and Company before. So it was a brand new thing. And then what we have to recognize too, as we go further into the book, we're going to want to see how his approach, and we'll talk about that when that chapter happens, how his approach to the final book really begins to change after the monthly deadline of serialization is through. He's not working on a deadline or any kind of conscription at all anymore. So, so I think that's a really key factor.
Two things about Shakespeare and Co. First of all, I don't know if you, sorry, I'm owning it. I don't know if you can still do this, but just in case you're feeling trapped in your house, you used to be able in Paris to go to Shakespeare and Co. And they would have some people sleep upstairs in the bookstore. So you could do your sort of literary pilgrimage to Shakespeare and Co. and sleep upstairs and help to shelf books. So I don't know if that's still happening, but that
Still do
definitely was
that.
going on. And yeah.
Yeah, I've done that as well.
Sorry.
I said it's happening. I've done that as well. I did a couple of years ago.
Terrific. Oh, thank you. And then the other thing is that, isn't it the Shakespeare and Co. where you can see now who took what books out from, is that right? From the library? It's really neat. You can see who's checking out which books at what time. Well, that would be the bookstore. So what's the library? Anyway, you can see now who was taking books out and who was buying books. And there's all these digital projects that are online that are worth checking out. So if you're also feeling trapped at home for that reason, we have access to all these materials now of who was moving where, and we can put a link to that.
Great. Yeah, that's great, Mahek, that you got to do that. I'm really jealous. I would have just painted though. So. All right. So the next one, which I know we're not showing you this lovely slideshow that I put together.
They're not seeing it still?
I don't think so. I don't think that Michael's been able to figure that out, which that's okay. So you missed some really good pictures, but they're mostly just our talking points anyhow. All these things will get worked out by next week. But one of the things that really needs to get talked about is the censorship of this book. You want me to just let you go?
Sure.
Yeah, so this is a real key feature. So go ahead.
I think we're going to talk a lot throughout the pendency of this course about the importance of this book and the impact that it had on many aspects of culture, right? And the way it impacted modernism, the way it impacts the way that we think about storytelling. Stream of consciousness is something I think we just kind of take as granted as a storytelling feature. There's really interesting, studies done about algorithms and fractals, and there's like a mathematical study of the fractal-like nature of certain novels, and the book that scored almost 100%, sort of following the format of certain, fractal mathematic equations was Finnegan's Wake, like just almost a perfect match, right? So you think of, Ulysses as almost the first hypertext, right? The first, connected nodular model, right? A nodular novel, nodular way of telling stories. My favorite notion about the impact of Ulysses, I don't know if you've ever seen the Third Man, right? Graham Greene, Orson Welles, right? And you've got this, the main character is a hack writer, and he's running around Vienna post-war, and Vienna is all divided up between the Soviets and the U.S., and they're trying to find all these awful criminals, and this guy's, posing as an important author, and he gets invited to speak at some sort of Viennese literary society, and he's winging it. He would write cowboy novels. He was a journalist, but he wrote basically Westerns, and he's trying to talk about his Westerns as if he's a literary writer. And he was asked, what do you think about, James Joyce's Ulysses? And he begged off the question, right? He's like, I don't know, never heard of it, and certainly never read it. But that kind of, the way that it gets referenced, the way that it's held in high regard. But there's these are the exciting pieces, right? These are the, the sort of cultural impact. I'm going to talk about the very boring aspects of what Ulysses has meant to the world. No, I don't need it. Yeah. So we're going to talk about Ulysses' impact, both on censorship and the legal definition of obscenity. And I'm going to talk about the impact of that on copyright law. And to get to the heart of that, you need to understand the fakakta way that this book was actually published. And you've gone through a good bit of that, right? But, for years, it's circulated in manuscript form amongst the literati, the glitterati of Paris. And, was eventually published in serial form in the US, right? And your two major publishing centers of the universe were New York and London at the time, not Paris, right? New York and London is where he wanted to get published. So he starts publishing in the Little Review. Margaret Anderson, Jane Heap, 1918 to 1920, published it essentially in magazine form, right? Each chapter each episode as its own, publication, right? And it begins to draw the attention of the censorship board, of the censorship authorities. And we have round one of Ulysses and censorship. And on round one, Ulysses loses, and it loses bad. So they bring the Society for Vice, I forget the exact name of it. Society for the Suppression of Vice. New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which I think you love. It sounds like a comic book, like fake. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Doesn't even sound like a real organization, right? But it was. And so they prosecute Anderson and Heap for obscenity. And the lawyer at the time, John Quinn, who was sort of famous amongst the New York literati, makes all kinds of arguments as to why the book was not obscene. That two of the judges said, I don't even know what the hell I'm reading, which he seized on. That's right, it's so obscure, it can't be obscene if you can't understand it. That was sort of their main, the main argument. He made a fantastic argument where the prosecutor was losing his mind over Quinn's arguments, pounding the table, going full Khrushchev, right? Taking his shoe off, banging it on the table, going nuts. And Quinn says, look at him. He is mad all over. He wants to hit somebody. He doesn't want to love anybody. That's what Ulysses does. It makes people angry, but it doesn't tend to drive them into the arms of some siren, right? Judges all laugh. He thinks I nailed it, walks away. I won. He didn't. They get convicted of obscenity. They get hit with a $50 fine. And this, we're going to come back to at the end of this discussion. This ought to send a bit of a chill down your spine. Okay. See the pints being delivered. and silent man behind all. And cannot thank you enough for that, Paul. Thank you. So at the end of it, he wants to save his clients from getting, thrown in prison, right? They only got was a fine. They got a slap on the wrist. So he says to Anderson, and for God's sakes, don't publish any more obscene literature. Anderson says, how am I to know when it's obscene? And he says back, I'm sure I don't know, but don't do it. Okay, that's a problem. And I'm going to come back to that sort of at the end of this quick bullet point discussion. So now you can't get Ulysses in the States anymore. That was in 1921. We get the obscenity ruling. Luckily, a year later, 1922, Shakespeare and Company publishes it. However, the book could still not, couldn't be imported here, and sure as heck couldn't be manufactured here. Now that matters from a copyright perspective at the time. Copyright law, to have U.S. copyright, there were really stringent formalities that you had to follow, and one of them was it had to be manufactured in the United States. Actually, had the typeset had to occur in the United States, and there was an incredibly complex issue with foreign authors trying to time, when the book would be published in London, like almost like simultaneously, like start the presses, go. And, and at the time when there was, you're sending stuff by letter, right? I mean, I don't know, transatlantic, line was in place then. I think it might have been, but so you're doing it by telegram. You don't have the communications that we have today. So gets published in France, 1922. Sylvia Beach does not get manufactured in the U.S., and now it opens it up to piracy. There's a famous publisher pirate named Samuel Roth. Samuel Roth was famous for just sort of laying in wait for all these poor foreign authors to screw up, and then he would do his own, sort of penny ante version of it. But Joyce sues him. So now, Ulysses is circulating. Now, how did Roth escape the censors and Anderson and Heap didn't? I actually don't know the answer to that. I bet you Paul Sandemore knows the answer to that, but I don't know the answer to that.
I haven't put him in.
Yeah, what the heck?
Yeah.
Is he? I did not know that. I did not know that. As a fractal. So there's, so from 1922 and to 1930 or so, this thing is being sold in cheap versions, no fealty to the typesetting. God knows how many mistakes there are in it. Joyce sues him in 1928, not for copyright infringement, but for trademark publicity infringement, because he's using his name on those, in those episodes, and wins. So he gets an injunction against Roth. So 28, Roth can no longer sell his pirated Ulysses. Now Bennett Cerf from Random House, sniffs an opportunity, right? And by now the book has been circulating for 15 years. Everybody knows what it is. Everybody more or less knows what's in it. But he's going to push this sort of absurd obscenity law that's out there.
It's probably the most famous book
Some people read it.
Not many.
No, it's true. So 1932, Cerf decides that he's going to publish it. He's going to hire a famous lawyer named Morris Ernst to help push the censorship. They've got to fabricate a violation. So they get it imported. U.S. Customs makes its way through U.S. Customs. So Ernst got to go back, like, hey, buddy, take a second look, at the package here. And so they open up and they confiscate it. They do it again in May of 1932, and now we're off to the races. Another obscenity trial gets held, and in one of the most famous, anti-censorship opinions. If you haven't read it, you should. It's very eloquently written. It's tremendously prejudiced and biased against Irish, which is, I find slightly funny, but he basically says, look, this can come in. The book I do not find to be obscene. Obscenity is defined as the meaning of the word obscene is legally defined by the courts as tending to stir the sex impulses or to lead to sexually impure and lustful thoughts. And then he goes through a very thoughtful analysis as to context, right? So it's censorship in context. What was the book really about? Sex is a part of life. Is he treating it, purely to, excite the senses? He talks to some of his literary friends. And this is not how the law works today, ladies and gentlemen. You don't issue a court opinion. I talked to a buddy of mine. He told me it was fine, so I thought it was fine, which is basically what's in the opinion. And so modern day corollary, Robert and I and Mike Bersanti and Josh Levitas start a comic book project where we adapt Ulysses and put it onto the iPad, and we get censored. We get a little bit of notoriety, from that censorship. and they censored us because there was an image of a bare-chested goddess, and the bare-chested goddess is the milk woman. If you listen to my teaser that I read before this, that was the scene that Robert was illustrating, and we went to Apple and like, gee whiz, why is this? Is this going to excite the senses? Why, is this obscene? Should we pixelate it? Should we remove the bare chested? No nudity in App Store, period. And as ridiculous as it is to say that Ulysses tends to excite the sex impulses, you're telling me that a comic book adaptation of a book that nobody's read, that has been around for 100 years, that meets the Apple standard of obscenity. And so the reverberations of this, right, the way that this notion of obscenity, still adheres today, is sort of important. So, the book gets published. One of the things that they do in order to secure copyright is Bennett Cerf sends the manuscript back to Joyce and says, go to town. We need some revisions. Because the copyright now is not on the 1922 edition. That's gone. That's in public domain. The copyright is in derivative works. It's in the new stuff that Joyce creates. So if you want the canonical version, the Random House version, right, 1934, you can get the lesser 22 version that doesn't have all this new fantastic revisions and stuff, but the copyright really is very thin. It only exists in the new material that Joyce added when he made some revisions. And
so the Oxford World Classics, Jerry, the Oxford World Classics one, which is a reprint of the 1922, which is the one I first read, is not therefore under that Random House copyright.
That is correct. That is, was, and always, has been, public domain. And so there's a good friend of Ulysses Scene, a good friend, I think, to many people on this call, named Robert Spoo. And we're going to get, is he awesome? So we're going to, well, let's talk about that now. So one can forgive James Joyce for really, really, really caring about copyright, right? After watching what Roth did, and and you have to think that at some point he took Giorgio was his son, all right? And he took Giorgio and he took his grandson Stephen James Joyce, right? The name is not a mistake, Stephen James Joyce, right? And you can imagine Grandpa sort of raging around the fire, after a couple drinks about copyright and Samuel Roth and how important copyright is and how the thieving bastards stole from him over all of his life. And man, Stephen James Joyce got that letter, right? He got that memo, and he spent the bulk of his life terrorizing Joyce academics, requiring permission anytime you quoted from Ulysses. As a copyright lawyer, some of that permission I find baffling that you'd even would try to ask for it. Fair use is very hard to cabin as an attorney, hard to give you guidance on because the courts are all over the place. But that cuts both ways, right? It's as uncertain if you're trying to enforce your rights as if you're trying to figure out what you're allowed to do. And, academic quotations is sort of canonical fair use. But nonetheless, there was just this standard where people would get permission from him, and he would try to extract concessions, like, also, if you support me here, I'll let you quote here. Some of the more ridiculous things that he did, he described academics as like rats and lice. They should be exterminated. Present company excluded. Everybody, you guys are cool. You guys are safe. I'm not gonna okay, but he threatened the Irish government, against proceeding with public readings of Ulysses on the centenary of Bloomsday, June 16th, 1904. The Irish government wanted to read from Ulysses, and he said, no, I don't want people to actually care about this book anymore. Like the one chance he had, the marketing, right? He shut it down. He threatened, this one's my favorite, genetic scientists for using quotes from Portrait of the Artist to name genetic sequencing of synthetic microbes, to live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. Okay, that quote that I just quoted live on YouTube, come at me, bro, is what he wanted to have for a genetic sequence of a microbe. It's like fair use piled on fair use, piled on fair use, and came after them. And then, of course, Karl Schloss, right? He threatened an academic, wrote a book about Joyce's daughter for quoting from letters. And Michael Groden with the
super sad one for me. I saw him present on James Joyce Hypertext back in the day, and it was so cool. And it was going to be so cool. And you could click. It was sort of like the Joyce Project now, but you could, and this was a long time ago, and you could click on things and hear the music and click on things and see pictures. And it was amazing. And it got shut down.
Yeah, it was like this beautiful idea of what, I mean, the technology then was like CD-ROM technology, right? But the idea of some brilliant hyperlinked version of that could get you to all of the nuances and the annotations and onto other papers that were being written. It was amazing, an amazing project. That
It's sort of why, part of the reason I became a Joyce scholar, because he gave this presentation when I was in college. I was like, wow, that's amazing.
okay.
What's his first name? I already mixed it. Michael Groden. Make sure you all got that. Michael Groden. So Robert Spoo is sort of this, this towering hero, Joyce scholar, tired of getting, bandied about by Joyce. Like, you know what? Why don't I go to Yale and get a copyright degree? And he did. He went to Yale Law School, got a degree in law, and started pushing back against Joyce. He's written a fantastic book called Without Copyrights that talks about the whole Roth situation. Really interesting sort of theories about, does copyright incentivize creation or not? Was a great thinker, a great Joyce scholar, and an overall round great guy. So I'm going to end with this. The impact of Ulysses on copyright law and people's attitudes and opinions to copyright, on academics' opinion to copyright, continues to reverberate. The impact on censorship of breaking down these barriers, looking at these things in context, right? Like we were asking Apple to do, please look at this in context, is very important. But the thing I want to go back to is that line, where Quinn says to Anderson, well, how do I know what's obscene? Hell if I know, just don't do it. That's terrifying, right? Because that hits at the legitimacy of law itself. We all know that legal opinions, jury decisions, the law is abstract. It's hard to follow. You get inconsistent decisions, or at least what appears to be inconsistent decisions. It can be fickle. But if it gets to the point where it's completely arbitrary, right, where it's just simply, and the standard for pornography, famous Supreme Court judge, what's pornography? I know it when I see it. What the hell is that, right? I know, you want and you're going to order your life, right? You're going to order, the law is what can and cannot do, how can I behave in a certain way? If you can't give me clear direction on that, the law itself loses legitimacy. And I would say that the Woolsey opinion is a strike against that, and not only preserve free speech, free expression, artistic expression, but was also a blow in favor of the legitimacy of the law overall. All right, I'm done.
Fantastic. I knew he could do that. So thanks. Yeah. Sure, Jack, you want to come on over here and take the microphone from me? Jack is another one of our guests here in the pub. So this next disembodied voice will be someone other than Quinn.
Apropos the definition of obscenity, you know it when you see it. A.E. Hausman was asked to define a poem once, and he said, I can no more define a poem than a terrier can define a rat, but I know it when I see it.
Oh, that's wonderful. The talk about copyright and the talk about censorship that I wanted to make sure we had here in our first class is because we don't often talk about the background of this book as a living thing. We can talk a lot about the background of Dublin. We can talk a lot about what we know of the history of James Joyce. But the book lives since it's been written. And I think that as an artist myself, I know that once you make a thing and you put it into the world, it has its own sort of unique life. And this book has a tremendously rich life for the past 100 years. And so I think talking about that and how it's inspired other people, hearing you talk about like Michael Grodin's presentation and how it drew you in, and Chad, how it drew you, and then also how it made Bob Spoo turn around and, and pursue law. It's that's what living with this book is like. And that's the way the book is living with us. So that's a real key component. And that sort of brings us enough of the background of the book. And now we get to talk about Telemachus. So there's been some stuff going on in the chat as to, I think, whether or not it was the book makes one lustful or not. But are there any questions before we start talking about Telemachus?
Yeah, I have a question actually.
Sure.
My question is that when you look at other books in literature that are notably censored, so like for example, Lolita or Tropic of Cancer, oftentimes even today these books are sort of tinted with that idea that they are like lascivious or that they're more profane. Do you think Ulysses has surpassed this reputation and that it's like taken on a characterization of its own, or do you think it still falls under those types of books and categories?
So it's interesting that you should choose those, those other books that you just mentioned. And it's interesting that we talk about censorship in terms of like lascivious qualities within a book or a work of art. And I think that that's a very modern aspect of censorship. But we also need to remember that Galileo was essentially censored for science, right? It's how you think about closing down new ideas that becomes problematic. Sometimes they're based upon social orders such as what we consider is going to, affect our youth and turn them into, homicidal maniacs or something like that, like they thought comic books would. Or like people still today think video games might, hopefully they've gotten over that notion. I think that censorship is an ongoing, and Chad can speak to this better, censorship is an ongoing battle with the new, right? It's protection against the new more often than not. But that being said, there are a lot of people that are envelope pushers for good or for bad. That, like I think about The People versus Larry Flint, for instance, sometimes we need to do things that tear apart those encoded systems of censorship. I don't think Joyce was doing that in writing Ulysses too much. I don't think he was a muckraker or a provocateur. I think he was writing what he thought would probably not be allowed, but he wasn't writing it just for that. I think he was writing it out of a truer place of thinking that that's what he should write about. We've talked about this, Megan, you and I, with the letters. The modernists like to write stuff, and they like to write stuff about that kind of stuff. So you want to say something on that?
I have some thoughts about that, although I haven't finished the thought. I've sort of gone somewhere and I'm not sure where to take it. So the fact that you brought up Lolita is interesting to me, especially given the biography that was just pulled, right? Because of the alleged sexual, does everybody know what I'm talking about, of the biographer? So there's a brand new Philip Roth, sorry, jump with me. Come with me on this path. There's a brand new biography of Philip Roth, and it has been pulled from the shelves because the author, whose name I cannot remember this second, sexually assaulted his students in high school, allegedly, or after high school. So there were essays and they came out after high school. He sort of groomed them. And one of the ways that he groomed them was through Lolita. He would assign Lolita and talk about Lolita. And I've thought about that, not only because there's a book called Lolita in the Afterlife, which I have to admit my sister-in-law just edited, so it's coming out. But but also that I was thinking, do people assign Ulysses as a grooming text? Yeah, right? Would that ever happen? I'm glad you're laughing. I had to think through it. And at first I was like, that would be ludicrous.
They did it once.
It's 700 pages.
It's
I mean,
not
you know.
successful. But on a more somber note, unfortunately, the IJJ, the International James Joyce Foundation, did have to come out with pretty clear regulations, and there was a statement about like what's appropriate behavior with students and professors. And I think Joyce is a boundary pusher, and it is often with relationship to sex and sexuality and the body and how we look at the body and disability and body. And think of the Gertie McDowell chapter. So I think I can't say to your lascivious question that people necessarily don't think of Ulysses that way. I think it has mostly because it's hard and people don't read it. Maybe a lot people don't know, but once you've taken a class on it, you might put it back with those others.
One comment, which is, if you've ever read his letters to Nora Barnacle, we knew we'd get back to this. Homeboy had a dirty mind, and I did. And he, like sweet Jesus, like those letters were just like a neutron star of obscenity, the tight packedness of obscenity. So he showed astounding restraint in Ulysses itself, right? So the notion that he was trying to push envelopes, oh no, I think he was, was that maybe 4% of the book, or the naughty bits, right? All comes out. So I mean, given the sheer repetition of obscene thoughts in his letters, the fact that he then wrote a gigantic novel and it only shows up in 4%, I think demonstrates that he was not out to shake sensibilities. That's just how he thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of set us down a different road here when I was talking about provocateurs and stuff like that. But I just find Joyce's approach to Ulysses to be a way of really trying to understand, according to his own principles, what a book could or could not have in it. Not so much pushing other people's impression or constraints on that, but finding it for himself. So I'm seeing a couple of things coming up in the chat, though. Mehek and I'm not really watching the chat because I have to put glasses on and it distracts me too much. So if when they come up, you guys can either use a raise hand feature, or we can just kind of like let you talk about them now, or we can use Mehek. Hi, Mehek.
Hi. So Christian actually asked a follow-up question, which is, do you have any sense for how much of Ulysses' success early on could be attributed to the scandal of its obscenity trial?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I don't approach it from that historical perspective of the spread of the popularity of the book. But, Joyce had people watching him on many scores and spreading rumor about this book during the period of time that he was writing it. Like it was a greatly anticipated thing while it was coming out slowly in the little review. So, and he had people like Twala Barnes and people like writing about the wonder of this book. Like I made a crack earlier that there was a period there that it was the most famous book that nobody had read because there just weren't that many copies of it anywhere for people to have read them that much. So I don't really know the answer to that, Christian. Oh, he does. This is, like I said, I've joked about this before. Some cartoonists go and find an inker. I had to go find a copyright attorney.
So I'm trying to find the passage, but there's a, so this is a great book. If you can find it, there's a couple of versions still available online. It's are all secondhand. It's a United States of America versus one book entitled Ulysses. And it's basically a collection of all of the articles, newspaper articles, magazine articles, commenting on the obscenity trial and on it being found not obscene, and it's just jam packed with like 1930s snark. I mean, it's like reading an H.L. Mencken, essay. It's pretty awesome. So there's a reference in The Nation. Here we go. I think I found it. James Joyce's Ulysses, for 11 years, the most famous of our bootleg classics, is legal at last, at least insofar as the government of these United States is concerned. Prohibition, to be sure, did not prevent the literati from being as familiar with the book as they were with cocktails, and copies of Ulysses carried on the hip gave young collegians a kind of prestige comparable to that achieved by the pocket flask. So yeah, I think the obscenity had quite a lot to do with its popularity. This is right after it was deemed not to be obscene. You've got lots of snark stuff.
That's great. What else have we got in the chat, Mac? I thought you said something else.
Oh, we have one more question, and this actually will probably open up the Telemachus conversation really well. It was asked by Martin on the Facebook stream, and it is, what is the reader's role / position in Ulysses?
Oh, great. Martin will be if that's Martin Hurley, is that Martin Hurley? Yeah. Martin will be a guest with us later in the series. So, yeah, give me that question again, and let's kind of turn our brains on that.
Yeah, the question is, what is the reader's role / position in Ulysses?
You want me to go? Okay. You are going to wrestle with this book. This is a book of puzzles and enigmas. This is a book of, we will talk about this many times. I like to think about reading this book as for the first time as being dropped into the middle of a city that you kind of know a little bit of the language, but you don't know how they do things, and you don't really know. You know where the bakery is, but you don't know where to get your clothes washed, right? Like, you just have to kind of find every corner and nook of this new city. And for anyone who's ever lived in a situation like that, that is just a beautiful moment of discovery. It just connects you to a new town, connects you to a new city. Reading this book is a lot like that. Your role as a reader within this book is to not just solve the puzzles, but to enjoy what they're telling you, and sometimes what they're telling you about yourself. I think that's probably where I would begin with it. And the answers that you're all going to have are going to be different by the time you get to the end of the book. So, you got something?
I think that's good. I was going to object to you. I was going to object non-responsive, but I think I'll let you go. Because I think part of the question is, that's right. Thank you for that. Cheers. It's sort of like the question was, what's the role of the reader in the book, right? It's almost like this sort of meta, if once on a winter's night, a traveler, right?
I think I'm going to say no on that.
Okay.
I think he's asking about where the reader is positioned in responsibility to the book. Like,
not so much
the role of the reader, but like, and Martin, if you're on the Facebook thing and you're coming back, then go ahead and tell us. But what are we as readers supposed to be thinking as we come into the book?
Not what is our role in sort of helping to shape the narrative or create the narrative or be involved in, the recursiveness, right? The meta aspect of it.
Yeah. I liked your answer too. I think it is a book that teaches you how to read it, as many do. But the problem with Ulysses is every chapter teaches you differently. So you have to be willing to go, wait, what chapter am I? But you have to remember what was said in the last one. So it feels like a board game or something. You're constantly relearning how to play, but someone's giving you a new game, but you have to remember the old rules. And then all of a sudden, it's about why you were playing this game. So if that's maybe a meta answer, it's like you're playing, everything's cool. And then all of a sudden they're like, but why are you playing? Why are you willing to play? And should you be playing? And then, so that's my answer.
That's dynamite. Okay, that's great. Have we got any more? Or should we start digging into Telemachus?
I think it's Telemachus time.
It's Telemachus time. All right. So we've already done some stuff here where we've talked about Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and who Stephen was in that book. And for those people out there who may not have read it, oh, look, there's one right now. The camera is there, and I keep trying to remind you, because you do the same thing I do. You watch. I was trying to figure out a way to do that without kind of going. But you have this. You do the same thing I do, where you're like looking at the people on the Zoom call. So that's okay. It's okay. We're all learning it. But I think what we'd like to do maybe is, I already set Michael up with this idea of reading those closing lines from Portrait for us, and we're going to talk about how that book might lead us to who Stephen is now, and maybe how we might be able to think about who Stephen is now to redefine those last lines of that book. So, Michael, you want to go ahead and go?
Yep, just give me 1 second to draw it up. We're starting. This is probably the last like maybe half a page of it. Diary entries begin on April 16th. Away, away. The spell of arms and voices, the white arms of roads, their promise of close embraces, and the black arms of tall ships that stand against the moon, their tale of distant nations. They are held out to say, we are alone. Come. And the voices say with them, we are your kinsmen. And the air is thick with their company as they call to me, their kinsmen, making ready to go, shaking the wings of their exultant and terrible youth. April 26th. Mother is putting my new secondhand clothes in order. She prays now, she says, that I may learn in my own life and away from home and friends what the heart is and what it feels. Amen. So be it. Welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. April 27th. Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead. Dublin, 1904, Trieste, 1914.
That was great. Thank you, Michael. On the smithy of my soul. Like, wow. Sounds great. Sounds like victory. Right? But does victory mean leaving? Right? Does victory mean, oh, mother's packing up my clothes for me? And then old father, old artificer, like, that stuff's kind of a wrinkle at the end too. So this was Stephen Dedalus then. So how would we compare that with Stephen Dedalus now? Does he seem that way in Telemachus? And I think I'd like to use this opportunity before, Megan and I totally explode all over all this, to ask one of the students in the class to step up and tell me what they think, how that quote goes with the Stephen, the sleepy, unclean, unwashed, Stephen that we see in Telemachus. And you know what? I'm just going to call on somebody. Ha ha. Kenneth, how about you? You're on mute. I can't see you right now. He's logging himself back in. Hi there.
Hey, this is not the one I can answer. I just stepped away for some requirements and just returned. So sorry, I can't. I knew as soon as you said you're going to call us, I'm like, it's got to be me. It's got to be me.
Well, you just happen to be the one furthest to the top of my screen, buddy.
So I'm sorry that I can't address this one because I just got back to my computer.
Christian or Colin or anybody want to take it, or Margareta? You don't want to do it? Look at you, look. So Christian's coming in. Hey,
yeah. So I guess the quippiest kind of response I can give is if, that ending of Portrait really sounds like Stephen's in his Daedalus phase. And he feels a lot more like Icarus plunged into the water in Telemachus. Yeah, he's so dark and moody. I have to wonder, as much as what happened to his mother in the white space between the books probably played into that. Portrait really ends with him tackling that, his dreams as an artist, his goals. And I'm wondering, what kind of difficulties did he face in that self-challenge of becoming excuse me, I have a lot of noise right now. I took on a challenge. But as much as he wanted to become what does he say? It was the what of his race?
To forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race.
Thank you, Michael. I have to wonder what challenges he then faced in forging that conscience in the time in between novels, because the sense I get in chapter 1 is really one of melancholy and failure.
There's the
Absolutely.
there's the great when in Nestor, when Stephen is teaching the children and he asks them the question, what is a pier? Or he's asked the question, what is a pier? And the answer is a disappointed bridge. And for him, that has sort of become like, his sort of failed attempts to live a life in Paris, his sort of failed ideal of like moving away and doing all these things that sort of he was so determined to do as an artist. And then, when we're reading him in Ulysses, I mean, he's, it's fucked a little bit. Sorry to use language. I'm not sure if we decided on the letter rating of this chat, but
You'll have to figure that out for Facebook later.
Oh yeah, we'll figure it out. I think there's a really nice texture to, making him a failure at the start of this, as someone who's just sort of like failed in every way and is sort of like lost in this morning, sort of lost, is so young. I mean, is clearly like the sort of young man character, but is very like lost in the melancholy of realizing that life is very long and difficult.
That's great. Yeah. Hey, Mahek, I would ask you this question too, because while you took our class recently at Penn, I don't know that we really dealt that much with when we opened it up with like the closing lines of Portrait. Did we? Do you remember that part of the class better than Paul or I do? Because we're like looking at each other going, I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm having Wi-Fi problems right now, so sorry if my audio is bad, but we went over the ending lines of Portrait on the first day because that was the same day that I finished Portrait, and so I was thankful to sort of end.
So you're basically saying that I'm repeating myself.
No, not at all. But we definitely did go over the lines, and we talked about the sort of interim between the two books a little bit.
Yeah, I like that Christian called it the white space between the two novels. Like, and we find out things that happen in that white space. Like even in this first chapter, we find about his mother dying, and like those talks between Mulligan and Stephen about his mother dying and him not bowing down beside her from prayer. They're hugely important if you came to Ulysses from just reading Portrait. You're affected by that white space even more so. I don't know, Megan, you want to go here a little bit?
Sure. I'm glad we got to talk about it at the beginning a little bit too. I wonder, aren't you hugely affected by those lines, even if you haven't just finished Portrait? I guess that would be, I mean, it's so clear that her haunting connects to the sea and the snot green and what it means to be an Irish writer. And so now I'm contradicting myself at the beginning saying you need to have read Portrait. But I don't. Do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. The other thing I would say is that Portrait for me is just also a series of, so he had the essay, A Portrait of the Artist, and then he had Stephen Hero, and then he had Portrait of the Artist. So there are all these, and then he signed postcards, Stephen Dedalus. I was reading this thing today in an early volume of Eliot introducing James Joyce, and he said he makes you need to know his biography in order to read him. And so maybe I'm saying you need to have read Portrait of the Artist, but you also need to have read his own life and think through that and how he has changed and who he is writing it at that time. So that's part of In the White Space too.
I just saw something come up in the chat about James Joyce invented selfies. I haven't been following the chat, but I don't know how that came about. Who put that up there?
He took the most careful photo of himself and put it into words over the course of his life.
Nice. I like that. Yeah.
That's why it's called a portrait.
I think that when we encounter Stephen is when we encounter the book, right? And I'm thinking now, I'm kind of back to Martin's earlier question about the role of the reader, right? Because I'm trying to understand, like, okay, I'm picking this up and I'm reading it for the first time, and I haven't just come off of Portrait, and I'm trying to figure out who this character is in relationship to this stuff. Now, if I've read Portrait, I might feel pain in Stephen for not bending down. And I might feel less pain and more arrogance if I have not read Portrait, you know? It kind of speaks to what Chad was saying about him being a, you know, sort of an emo, a poser and all that sort of stuff earlier on. So it's important to kind of remember that there's a gamesmanship here to Joyce using this character from this previous novel and making you kind of go, oh yeah, go read that. But there's also, I think there's a direct change that has happened in that white space between the two of them, and that we're supposed to really kind of figure him out in that light, and it's bigger that way. So is Portrait a prequel?
I can't have that going on.
Yeah, and prequels are not usually good. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. She just mentioned Wide Sargasso Sea, so catch that. Chad, what do you got on this? Anything?
Nope. Stick by my guns.
The law stuff is over. So we have Stephen. We're encountering him here. He's different than the other one. What do we want to say about Buck Mulligan?
He's plump and stately.
That's. I thought you were done.
A little something. He's funny as hell, right? You know, the comedy, the humor. I mean, one of the things that, you know, this book that I mentioned, this Ulysses, you know, the United States versus Ulysses, the foreword was done by Richard Ellman, right? You know, Joyce's biographer. And he ends this, you know, discussion about the censorship and the obscenity and everything that went on. It's like, yeah, but everybody forgets the book is funny. The book is funny. And it's a great ending, very eloquent ending that Ellman, you know, sort of punctuation point, like, yeah, let's just get beyond this nonsense and really appreciate the book for what it is. And, you know, as all encompassing as life itself, right? The great eternal yes. We'll get into that later with Molly. But that is, you know, the book is, the entirety of the book is, right? The soliloquy at the end. That's that all encompassing. It's obscene, it's dirty, it's tragic, it's heartbreaking, it's funny. And Buck is funny. And, you know, what I tried to convey when I was reading, you know, the milk woman portion was he's screwing with the milk. You know, he's like giving her a hard time. He's making fun of her behind their back with his Oxford buddy, right? And he's, you know, the collector of prepuces. Do you know what prepuces is? I didn't know, even after I read the book, you know, 20 years ago. It's, you know, collecting foreskins, you know, and they're just making fun of the Irish, the Colchies, right? It's, you know, these sophisticated, you know, Dubliners making fun of the Irish Hicks. And you know, we know that those people.
But she's not, actually. I should point that out. She's not in the way that you've talked about the Irish Hicks being people outside of Dublin, you know, that's beyond the pale, right? She's not. She's lower working class, like struggling by, but Dubliner. She does not
Right.
speak Irish. It's not like she doesn't even recognize it. Thinks it might
But
be.
he's making fun, like, you know, him. You know, he's talking to Haynes and making fun of, you know, Irish folk history. Like they're at the same time, you know, and it sort of makes it precious, right? The way that Haynes. It's like, I'm going to collect the sayings of all these charming Irish people, and you know, and he's his own particular odious, you know, type character, right? But Buck Mulligan, he's mocking everybody, right? He's mocking Haynes, he's mocking Yeats, you know, he's mocking, you know, the Irish Spring, or the Irish Spring. He's not mocking soap. The Celtic Spring, right? He's mocking the. You know, he's mocking that whole movement, and you know, he's sideways glances. He's in league with Haynes. Every once in a while, he's got a smart ass comment to Stephen, and sometimes he jokes only with himself. And I think he's a great character.
Buck Mulligan is very funny.
Listening to made me become Stephen, and I felt displeased. I mean, why is he mocking all those people? And Stephen stands there saying, like, why do you have the right to mock them, right? And I agree with you. Buck is funny, but Stephen isn't laughing anymore for a lot of it, right? And that's also, so we want to laugh at him for that. Like, it's so adolescent,
friends,
right? He is.
I am one of those friends. Like, you know,
Yeah,
it's, at some point,
the joke is over, and it's also something you like about this book is it's asking you. I think it does that. Like when the laughter ends, what's there, kind of, right? Like, so Stephen, he's silly because he's so caught up in his own emotions about things, and yet we like that he doubts Buck. We like that they hit heads and that Buck mocks him, but we also like that at this point he thinks there's something more than this friend of his, and he wants to. So I totally agree with you that Buck Mulligan's very funny, and I love the funny bits.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to do a little bit on the frictions there between Buck Mulligan and Stephen, but I also want to point out something that people forget. He's very funny. Yes, he's very, very funny. He makes fun of everyone, but also the Ballad of Joking Jesus, right? Like the character who Buck Mulligan is based upon, Oliver St. John Gogarty, did write that piece. James Joyce did not write that piece. And it was sort of published in like little handbills and things like that, you know, but not really published and given to people. And Joyce stole it and put it into the book, you know, like, so in terms of what we were talking about before, you know, like he's really having one up on Gogarty when he's actually putting this in the book with his name on it as if he's the author of it.
And that relationship soured, right? It's sort of like if you ever, you know, meet somebody at any stage in your life that you think is a great writer or could be a great writer, don't piss them off. Because, you know, it's Gogarty doesn't, you know, at the end of the day, Mulligan doesn't necessarily come off well, and Joyce has quite a lot of axes to grind with him that show up.
Joyce has quite a lot of axes, and he does a lot of grinding. There's a lot of people that he likes to get back at, but that was one particular unique case of it that I was always excited to hear about. But there's this comparison that I really, really love. I don't have the line, maybe you do, but it's when they're on the tower together, and when Mulligan takes him under his arm and asks about like the offenses, and he says, his arm, Cranley's arm, right? So Cranley, you would not know without Portrait. And I think we need to kind of talk about the connections there between Cranley and Mulligan and what it might paint about the relationship for Stephen and Mulligan. You want to do that? Here we go.
Is it in Ulysses where he says the love that dare not speak his name? So he moves Cranley from just in Portrait being a true friend, a better friend, to all of a sudden suggesting Wilde's could it have been an attraction? Could it have been more? And Oscar Wilde as a figure comes up a lot in Joyce as the sort of Irish predecessor who. Yep. Yeah. And at one point, Joyce is asked about homosexuality, if it's horrible, and he says, "No, it's the natural outcropping of a boys' boarding school." So he sort of won't criticize homosexuality the way that you might have thought he would. And then throughout the book, then of course you see all different kinds of attractions and changes and loves. And the one that I was interested in when I was in grad school was the Pygmalionism you often see. And throughout Joyce's work, there's a lot of sexual attraction to statues. And throughout, like from Exiles, there's like to Molly Bloom, there over and over again, people think about a statue as an object of possible sexual attraction. Why am I talking about that? Only because I think Joyce knew Freud was interested in the idea that sex doesn't have to have a single object. And he was curious about why it is that especially given, as I said, he was cursing the system that made his mother have to give the breast year after year after year, what it would mean for sex to be liberated beyond that kind of necessary regenerative heterosexual marriage sanctioned by the Catholic Church. So I think that in terms of Cranley, that close friendship, we know it was based on his friend, and that he didn't like his representation in Ulysses, so that didn't go well. But I think that Cranley stands out as sort of a staunch friend to him, who it could have become more, but Stephen walks away from that into his more angry, isolated Nietzschean self.
Is that a homophobia that's going on there, or is it also possible with Stephen that it's somebody's got to be on top?
Yeah, I think he's so isolated. I don't even know, because I don't see it as a homophobia on his part, because it's almost like I have to love myself. I can't trust anyone if I'm going to become this Ubermensch artist. So.
Yeah, great point. Yeah. Does anyone have something from the questions regarding that, or from the chat? Yeah, I think understanding the relationship between those two is very good. There's also a moment when they're starting to walk down to the 40-foot hole, and they're asking about about Stephen's Hamlet theory, and Haynes is asking, he compares Martello Tower to Elsinore, and there's this moment where Stephen sees himself as very separate from the others, but there's also this sympathetic moment of Mulligan seeing him see that turns on, like he just becomes the clown suddenly there, as if he's to kind of like take Stephen outside of the shell of his own mind for a moment. Mulligan, in some ways, as Chad said, he's really funny. In some ways, he's an asshole and a turncoat later. But I think that he has a genuine fondness for Stephen that Stephen can't take, and that will be answered better by somebody like Bloom. So
You haven't mentioned the key yet. Are you getting into the key and the Hamlet aspects and the homelessness and the throwing them out? I don't have much to say about it. I'd rather hear from smart people like you guys. But I mean, I think that is sort of, no pun intended, key to the entire episode. Right, that the very sort of nuanced moment right after the 40-foot men, which is an awesome sign and is still there, right? Is in Sandy Cove. No, it was in the 90s, man. Yeah,
because it's not only a 40-foot, right? There's a sign at the 40-foot hole, which is the swimming hole, and Paul actually swam there, which was yeah. He just I don't know if you heard him in jellyfish season and nearly got it's a miracle he survived. So it's this hole like 40 foot deep, right? And the sign used it was for years, although no longer is, a men only swimming place. And so the sign outside it says, if somebody's got that, by the way, Michael, if you could pull that up and show that like on a search, that'd be great to insert this here, where it says, or have you got it, Quinn, maybe? It says 40-foot men. And you're like, no, it's not only for 40-foot men.
They're not 40 feet at all. But yeah, very nuanced, right? Sort of, at the end, Kinch, let me have the key. And Kinch pauses, right? And eventually hands it over. And that dispossession, makes him, of like minds, makes them soulmates with Bloom later on. And that notion of being dispossessed, of being homeless, the whole Hamlet-esque, tower, instead of ghost of his father, ghost of his mother looming over him, that notion of, the anguish, right, of Hamlet, being dispossessed because of the murder of his father and wandering, and it just sets the stage, for what I think Joyce does with Irishness overall, right, and just in terms of, becoming wanderers within the world, of being dispossessed by the British, of trying to find their own identity, assert their own selfness, and I find that whatever. I find there to be a lot of corollaries with American literature and that notion of identifying, of identifying a self that's different from, our Britishness or English heritage that you'll see quite a bit throughout the rest of the book.
Yeah, it's great. Oh, you got something.
What Chad just did really beautifully was he did one of the ways I think that you can read Ulysses. So I always tell my students, one way is you just look for the humanness of it, the characters, who they are, how they know each other. And another way is you look for their correlations, their sort of mythic correlations or their literary correlations. And it's fun. And it also then hopefully ties together, right? So you can't only do one or the other. And you did both. Yeah.
The book is named after a wanderer. Right?
Yeah.
And our book is about, a dispossessed, hero trying to find his way back home.
So before we were sort of talking about Stephen and how he differed, and we were talking about him as just a character in a book and how he differed from Portrait. And then what Chad did was said, well, look at who he's mapping onto. So it's sort of a structuralist approach. He maps onto Hamlet, he maps onto Lemachus, he maps onto, and that's fun just to chart. And it's something that Stephen Dedalus does, but it's also great, as you did, to then link it to where the human anguish appears, so that it's the sadness not only of the character of Stephen, but the sadness of Hamlet. Have you guys all read Hamnet, by the way? I have to read that by next week, so I have not.
I have, and I'm curious about that one.
Fat Ham, it's amazing. Theater, have you seen that? Oh, is it good? Is it good? Yep. Streaming.
Wait, Fat Ham?
Fat Ham. It's an African-American version of Hamlet, done sort of in somebody's backyard in the Wilma Theater, streaming it till Sunday. It looks fantastic. Go see it. Janine Utel just posted it on Facebook. She just saw it and has endorsed it, so that's enough for me. I will go watch it.
Yeah, I'll check that out. I didn't know about that one. That is also going to come up, I think, in the lectures on the Google Classroom. I said this in at least one of them. it's not really that important for you to read and know your Homer thoroughly for this book. There's a lot of people suspect they might, and there's a lot of things, particularly in the early chapter, where it's useful to know that. But it really helps to know your Hamlet.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think knowing your Hamlet, taking you into this book, is something that's always going to come back.
You have to. I mean, like, when we get to the library episode, I mean, that you won't know what the heck he's talking about if you don't, have at least some basic understanding both of Hamlet and Shakespeare's, personal life, Shakespeare's biography.
Yeah, that's quite a few chapters away yet, or episodes. So, I wonder, do we need to do that for people that are not in the regular classroom? That they are called episodes and not chapters is a thing. And maybe we should speak to that a little bit. Megan, you want to do that?
Well, when I first read it, I didn't read, as we said. So this is the Gabler, right? The Random House Gabler edition.
Have we lost them?
Don't.
Oh no, not in the last 10 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna. Oh,
Oh, they're back.
What happened?
Anyway, I'll just keep going. We have 10 minutes left. Okay, so there are no episode names in the 1922 one. So it is possible that you did not need to know the names, and they're called episodes. Don't worry about knowing those names. I disagree that you need to know Hamlet more than the other things. Bye.
Okay. Wow. Are there questions in the chat that we need to get to, or should Megan and I fight about Homer? She'll win.
I guess a question about Homer before you guys begin your argument is how important, I mean, you touched upon this, but how many parallels should we be drawing between the Homer text and the Ulysses text, especially as someone who is familiar with the Homer story, but not so much as Ulysses? Is it helpful to know the Odyssey well enough to be able to understand Ulysses, or does that prove to be more detrimental in the long run?
You just made her argument. She's over there doing her Burns hands. Excellent.
Thank you for that. It's absolutely up to you. If you want to have the Gilbert and Lunati schema and you use it and that's how it makes sense to you, that's one way of cracking this book open. So if that is how you want to see it, it's a great way to start. And one of the best talks I ever heard on this book was by a classicist, and he explained to me how each of the Greek gods was actually embodying the style of each of the chapters, and it was amazing. But you don't need to know that. James Joyce said this is all part of, Ezra Pound said it's all part of James Joyce's old, you don't need to know that. That's his own way of constructing the book, and it's not necessary. So it's sort of up to you, but it sure is fun.
She wins. Yeah, I mean, so I'm thinking a lot about my position with Homer as a painter, right? So when I make a painting, right, and it's a still life, am I thinking about all the Cezanne still lifes that I've ever seen? The Giorgio Morandi still lifes that I've ever seen, or the Franz Hall still lifes that I've ever seen, and am I writing on top of that structure? And we're going to have some of that. Like I think I put in the reading, I think I put the some lectures on this. But the issue is the Homer is kind of a structural format, and then he writes those schemas later when the book is attacked and censored, like we talked about through the little review, to shore up its importance within the realm of Homer, to kind of play down the other stuff. I think that I pay less myself. I pay less attention to to the skeleton of impetus that let him make this novel be its own thing, right? Like there's a framework there, you know. And as a painter, when Quinn's over there doing a 5, 6. I'm so not used to this. There's a kind of a framework there, and I'm sure it's aware of all of those other things that go into it. Every time when we get to the chapters where he copies style, you see it intensely. So, okay, I think we're drawing to a close.
I got one more comment on that.
Of course you do, my friend.
So first of all, as Robert's friend and everybody knows, if we could have a Quinn, please follow him everywhere and just give like a 2-3 minute warning, that would be fantastic. Second of all, in praise of the schema, right? For a living, I'm a copyright attorney. I deal with in copyright and technology. I deal with data and databases and big data analytics and the data economy, AI, machine learning. I can't code my way out of a wet paper bag. But what I can do is understand, correlations and relationships. And a lot of my training as a lawyer, I think, came from Ulysses, came from the notion of a schema. Schema is what we talk about in data, legal issues all the time. Databases have schemas, and it's just, again, an important part of this book. Sort of anticipating what our world was going to look like, how hyper-connected our world was going to be, how nodular, right, and the way that different nodes connect. So I personally just find that the schema, the structure, components of it, not only incredibly important, but has had a major impact on my life. And I love the book because of that. And that's why I'm here drinking beer with all you fine people.
Wow, this has been great. You want a closing statement? Sounded like that was his.
Pardon me? That was his?
That's my closing.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was his. I've known him well enough. It's totally his closing statement. So.
Well, here's what I'm hitting my head against. I'm not sure you're gonna like my closing statement, but it's just something I'm hitting my head. I know I need to be more resounding. You can just cut me off, but we're thinking a lot in English departments about what it means to decolonize the English studies, right? Like how is it that because Joyce's idea of the tradition is, and he needs it, he builds upon it. That's the schema. But how much of it is a white schema, right? And where is it not? How are the Greeks not necessarily referring, like how can we rethink and still keep him valuable if the tradition he depends upon is by its very nature white supremacist? So that's just what I'm thinking about tonight. Bring it on. But I love to read Joyce, so I don't mean to undermine it. I actually think it's something, since I value him so very much, that I need to think through.
Why exactly did you think I would disagree with that one?
No, I didn't think you disagreed, but I didn't think it would be like a yay.
We have 2 minutes. Does anybody? We have 2 minutes left. Does anybody else on the Zoom want to answer? What do we do with Joyce in the sort of new world where we're realizing the legacy of colonialism and the sins of the Western world? Okay, we have 1 minute for that. Does anybody want to take that?
No, but I actually had a follow-up question, and I know we have 1 minute, so I'm going to make this very quick. But in Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, he talks a lot about and he talks, of course, about poetry, but I would argue Ulysses is kind of like poetry. He talks about how the poet, in order to truly adhere to the tradition, is that he has to contribute to the whole mind of Europe, and he has to bring something novel that honors everything that has come in the past. And do you think that this idea of tradition in Eliot's eyes is in accordance with what Joyce does in Ulysses?
Wow. How many minutes?
Yeah. And it's a scientific experiment too, which we can see that as well, right? And that's where it's sort of hypermedia. It makes us question what a novel is. And I don't think that's an answer to your question, but I think it's not just questioning the tradition, it's questioning how we write and how we communicate and how we know each other.
That's great. Guys, we're going to stop this recording because it's done now. And I just want to thank Megan and Chad for what's been a really fantastic discussion. And we're going to have 17 more of these. So after the recording stops, you guys are welcome to stay on the line for a minute just in case there's any other quick questions. Yep. We're going to start shutting it down. And we will look to see you next week with Ted Howell will be my guest, and we'll be doing the both Nestor and the Proteus chapters next time.
My students are asking about the soul.
Ooh, challenge.